Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots for the big picture of business in Africa. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, on the agenda, we examine our responsibility as African governments have to support asylum seekers. The recent xenophobic attacks in South Africa begs the question, how are struggling economies supposed to support and provide for refugees when resources are already scarce to serve its own population? Refugees face a myriad of challenges in their attempts to rebuild their lives, and this, coupled with deteriorating living conditions and a violent welcome, only exacerbates the already risky challenge of leaving home. According to Amnesty International, more than 21 million people worldwide have been forced to seek sanctuary. How exactly are African countries managing the challenge? But first, South Sudan is at the top of the list of countries seeing mass migration of movements as its citizens try to flee violent attacks. According to a UN report, more than 5,000 people left the country in the past few days following a fresh outbreak of violence in South Sudan's Equatoria state. Now, joining us to look at the cause of recent attacks via Skype from London is Matthew Kindinger, the senior Sub-Saharan African Analyst from Duka Frontier. Thank you very much for joining us, Matthew. So, how serious is this problem of refugees in South Sudan?
Well, it is a pretty serious situation at the moment, and it is getting increasingly serious. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a setback for the peace process in South Sudan, and at the moment it doesn't look as if the main parties in control in South Sudan, nor the international community is doing very much to help the situation at the moment.
And how, you say we talked about a figure of 5,000 people there, how do you think that might increase as the weeks and months go on?
It's difficult to tell to what extent it will increase, but provided that there's not a resolution to the violence in the Equatoria state, then it's likely to continue over the coming months.
And you mentioned the peace process there. There's this tremendous political jigsaw puzzle that's going on there, trying to give South Sudan the statehood that was promised, was it just 8 years ago nearly, or just over 7 years ago. How is that going, and what are the issues in there?
So that's a hugely complex question. To summarize, it's not going particularly well, although the two main leaders in Sudan, Kiir and Machar, have come to some form of agreement to create a government of national unity in May, so next month. Unfortunately, one of the major leaders in Equatoria state, so Mr. Seriti, is not on board. And this is because there are disagreements over future state boundaries, to what extent rebel forces will be integrated into the new army, and who will control security of the country's capital, Juba. In addition, there's also problems around a lack of coordinated policy over South Sudan from the international community as well.
And also the country's oil as well. I've been told by analysts recently that that is a factor, particularly in the relations with the rest of Sudan.
Yes, that's correct. So in a way, you could say that South Sudan and Sudan have a bit of a codependent relationship. So Sudan relies on transit revenues for oil from South Sudan, but South Sudan also relies on Sudan to get its oil exported. South Sudan really struggles to, well, the main thing that South Sudan will struggle with over the coming year or so, if this peace accord is agreed, is whether it can monetize its oil resources. It's one of the larger oil producers or it has the potential to be one of the larger oil producers in South Sudan, but the current state of affairs means it will be very difficult for the country to make the most of those resources.
So what is the way forward, you think, for South Sudan, bearing in mind the growing refugee problem and the political difficulties?
Well, there are a number of things that need to be resolved in order to come to a happier outcome. One is Machar and Kiir need to come to some sort of agreement with Cirillo, who's one of the major rebel leaders in Equatorial State in terms of power sharing. There also needs to be a more proactive approach taken by international powers such as the US in terms of putting pressure on local political parties and local groups to come to some sort of resolution to the problem.
And what about Salva Kiir and Riek Machar themselves? They've been sort of like a very on-off double act for quite a few years now in the South Sudan political scene. Are they on the same page?
So I would say their relationship is quite fragile at the moment. There'll be a real test coming up when this new government of national unity is meant to be formed in May. Their relationship will be really tested with regard to whether they can agree to a full integration of former rebel fighters into the new army, whether they can agree over establishing a new police force, for example. Those are just a couple of examples that could cause the current peace agreement to fall apart.
And just lastly, we have written several stories from here in South Africa about the companies from here doing business. There were very few of them doing business in South Sudan. A lot of them pulled out when the conflicts began years ago. What is the economic picture looking like?
It's not looking particularly bright at the moment. Some of the major contributors to the weak commercial landscape there has been the destruction of infrastructure. So there was a reconstruction and construction process that began after independence, but this has largely been halted by the onset of the civil conflict. So there is very limited commercial activity, and this makes it quite difficult for businesses to invest in the market. Effectively, you'll need to see a long-term resolution to the peace or to the insecurity in the country before investors consider arriving en masse.
Well, thank you very much for your insights. That was Matthew Kindinger, the Senior Sub-Saharan Africa Analyst from Duka Frontier. Now, Uganda shouldered the so-called burden of the African refugee crisis and opened its borders without complaint to their South Sudanese neighbours. Last year, the country estimated that $220 million was needed to manage the influx of refugees. The Ugandan economy is battling to manage the task. Any temporary or permanent disruption to humanitarian funding in Uganda will invariably have ramifications for some of the world's most vulnerable people. Now, joining us to paint a picture of the crisis in Uganda is Geno Teofilo, the regional head of communications for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you very much for joining us. And yes, this seems to have been a very well-intentioned act, neighbourly act by Uganda, but there's a danger that it may backfire.
It's very unfortunate that the funding for refugees in Uganda has dropped significantly, and this is an urgent problem that needs more addressing by rich countries from Europe, the United States. They really should increase their funding to support humanitarian programs for refugees in Uganda, because conditions are deteriorating in the refugee camps, and refugees are still arriving in Uganda, especially from countries like Democratic Republic of the Congo.
So how much worse could this problem get, the one that we're sitting with right now?
Well, it's too early to tell exactly, but what we do know is that the drop of funding that has been happening over time now, this could have serious consequences for refugees. A lot of funding is needed for programs such as health, such as water and sanitation, and for shelter. And by reducing the humanitarian aid for Uganda for refugees, it puts their lives at risk.
And how difficult is it in the current economic climate around the world to get governments to agree to set aside some of their exchequer for problems like the refugees of Uganda?
Well, one of the serious issues that we're seeing is that there has been a rise by certain people in power to demonize refugees in some of the richer countries. And of course, refugees don't deserve this. Refugees are just normal people who are fleeing for their safety and security. And we must remember that these people need aid to survive. Some of these politicians who have been saying that refugees are a problem, this has resulted in funding being reduced for humanitarian aid, and this must be reversed, or we could be seeing increases in mortality for refugees in Uganda and in other countries as well.
What's your greatest fear?
Well, our greatest fear is that there could be some serious outbreaks of disease in some of these countries that receive refugees. Some of the things that have happened in some of the countries in our region, for example, in recent years, there have been big outbreaks of cholera in some of the countries of East Africa, in some of the refugee camps as well. And of course, this can be fatal. There are other serious health problems such as malaria, acute watery diarrhea, and these can be fatal, especially to children. And unless aid is increased to increase life-saving programs for these refugees, we might be seeing increased mortality among refugees in several countries in the region.
Okay, on that optimistic note, we'll have to leave you. Thank you very much. That was Geno Teofilo, the Regional Head of Communications at the Norwegian Refugee Council. So coming up after the break, with the rise of xenophobic attacks in South Africa and a devastated SADC region following Cyclone Idai, we unpack the role South Africa should play to the increasing numbers of refugees seeking asylum. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, the ramifications of Cyclone Idai are being felt across the entire southern African region. Many people have been left homeless and are in dire need of sanctuary. South Africa was lucky enough to remain largely unaffected. However, the spillover effect might be linked to the xenophobic attacks which have sparked again in Johannesburg's township of Alexandra. Part of the insurgence of xenophobia against African refugees has been attributed to the fear that South African citizens will be left jobless and will enjoy even less of the country's economic pie, thanks to the scarcity of resources. Now, joining us to look at the aftermath of Cyclone Idai and all the ramifications around it is Tino Mambeu, an independent Zimbabwean political analyst, who will give us an insight on the political causes and impacts of not only the cyclone but also the xenophobia. Then from the Seriti Institute is Struan Robertson, the knowledge management coordinator, who will be better explain the country's growing strain to provide basic housing. And last but not least is Robin Lenahan, a candidate attorney, joining us from the Lawyers for Human Rights to help understand our legal obligation to help our neighbours. Do welcome, and this is the discussion. So starting off with yourself, Tino Mambeu, your country was affected by this slightly, but overall, what do you think about the political will there was around this rescue effort after Cyclone Idai?
First and foremost, it is very imperative that we should admit that in Zimbabwe we do not have a government. We have a group of people that have decided to call themselves a government after taking power through dubious means and going on to run fake elections that unfortunately we find that those elections were endorsed by the SADC and especially by Mr. Ramaphosa. And when the cyclone hit, there was no disaster preparedness. And we would have noted that it hit in Mozambique, and 4 days later it arrived in Zimbabwe. They had enough time to repatriate people from those areas that were on the route of the cyclone, but they did not do that. I think you would remember very well that the Minister of Defense, Comrade Opam Chinguri, said this cyclone caught us unawares. It has always been the case that the government of Zimbabwe is always caught unawares by natural disasters. We would have expected them to react in a much quicker and efficient way. But however, as I've said, there is no government in Zimbabwe, and such things are bound to happen where there is no leadership. The people that are currently in power are there simply for self-interest, and they do not really care about the people, because at the end of the day, they do not rely on the people to remain in power, they rely on the army.
But it's a wider thing than that. I mean, there was South African assistance that was sent. There was some other countries that were born into this. Do you think, from a legal point of view, where does that leave the people of Mozambique? Would they have a case in the Human Rights Court that they were abandoned in their hour of need?
Well, no. The difficulty in these kinds of situations of natural disaster is that there isn't really any international obligation on a neighbor state, for example. Our obligations are primarily humanitarian, not legal. For example, we don't have any obligations to bring in refugees, for example. There is this term that's often bandied about in the media and in other discussions of a climate refugee or an environmental refugee. When actually the international definition of what a refugee is has got to do with the fear of persecution in your own home country. In South Africa, that definition is actually extended, and it includes the AU definition, which is that a refugee is also included in the definition is somebody who's fleeing their state because of some sort of political disaster. It might be said that what is happening in our neighboring countries at the moment is a disaster that could be categorized by that, but that is probably unlikely. And so we have no obligation to either send aid or to accept refugees on an international legal level. I mean, absolutely, I would say that we have an obligation on a humanitarian level. And South Africa has, within limited resources, responded quite well on that level. I would agree that I think perhaps Zimbabwe hasn't responded in the right way. But no, the answer is that there is no legal obligation to respond.
And Struan, on a broader view on this as well, I mean, one of the bitter ironies of this whole thing is you have a people of Mozambique who have a very small carbon footprint, who are suffering for climate change by people who have huge carbon footprints around the world. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that's really important, because what climate scientists are predicting is that we can expect more severe weather conditions and cyclones will be worse. So we need and there's another aspect, if I can speak to Tino's point, that not only do we need safe sort of responses and preparedness when such disasters happen, we need a strategy for dealing with the long-term consequences, because the devastation that's been exacted by the cyclone will take years to recover from, and that requires a whole set of other kinds of interventions that require a lot of planning. And also, on Robin's point, I would say it's actually the African thing to do, given Ubuntu and the sense that we have responsibilities to one another. So that.
But going back to your point, Tino, I mean, do African nations, aside from Zimbabwe, your country, I mean, do you get that feeling of Ubuntu, that people are looking at Mozambique and saying, let's help out?
Well, citizens at large in Africa still have some semblance of Ubuntu. The only problem we experience at the moment, especially in SADC, is that the citizens have no leadership. And the citizens have always found themselves to be ahead of the leaders. I think in terms of responding to the cyclone, within Zimbabweans themselves in the country and here, there were various efforts that were made to donate. I think up to $1 million was raised by private individuals, citizens of the country, and you would have seen the donations that were done by the people within the country. So to a very large extent, the people are able to lead themselves, but the only lacking thing at this particular moment is I think is a strong institution in terms of the SADC, which seems to be unable to go with the desires of the century and the desires of the time. They are always late to respond, even in terms of xenophobia. It happens, people get killed, and they only respond probably 3 or 4 days later. And that is a sign of a lack of leadership in terms of the region in Africa.
I mean, Robin, I mean, this is your expertise. I mean, are you getting a spike in the number of cases of people fighting against xenophobia, trying to defend themselves?
No.
No.
I mean, yes, absolutely. It's very widely publicized that over the past few weeks there's been a massive spike in xenophobic attacks in South Africa. I think it's dangerous to link, either by civil society or, with all due respect, the media, to link the natural disaster and the humanitarian disaster that's happening in our neighboring countries to the xenophobic attacks happening in South Africa. For many reasons. I think that it's very obvious that the xenophobic attacks have much more to do with upcoming elections than an increase in migration, which is kind of what is being portrayed in the media, that people are coming across our borders as a result of this natural disaster and taking our resources, taking our jobs, all of the kind of rhetoric that we continue to hear. When actually the fact of the matter is that whenever this kind of natural disaster happens, people are forcibly displaced and do migrate, but they generally migrate internally. People very seldom actually cross borders. It's too difficult to do so, and there's no reason to do so. People are not in search of jobs, they're not crossing borders because of family ties. They're just moving somewhere in their country where it's safe for them to be. And so I think it's this kind of discussion about migration, the effects of migration because of what's happened in our neighboring countries and a link to xenophobia is actually probably quite problematic and could have disastrous consequences.
Struan, what do you think? What's your take on that?
I fully agree with Robin, what she's saying, in that there are other causes for hostility and volatility in communities. We have serious problems with poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunities. And this is where civil society can play a role in supporting the delivery of impact around programs and projects that deliver social and economic progress and opportunities for people, so that people can begin to sort of see that their strengths can help them work together, and so we can create better outcomes.
And your view, Tino, I mean, on this whole thing, do you think there should be some sort of policy in SADC to deal with these matters, or should we just leave it up to governments?
Well, the starting point is that SADC has got to admit that they do not have the capacity to lead, especially the current heads of state. I think I want to make reference to the statements that were made by Mr. Ramaphosa, where he said that we have got illegal immigrants that are setting up shops, setting up businesses. I think if we have got people that are setting up businesses in your country, that's something that should be applauded. But he said that those people are setting it up illegally. Why do we do not condone such behavior of setting up businesses illegally? It would seem that the people that are coming in here into South Africa, for example, are coming here to do business. So would it not be wiser for the politicians to make sure that it is easier for everybody that is in South Africa to do business? So what I see from all this is the matter of scapegoatism. You know, when politicians fail to deliver as expected by the citizens, they always find the blame and somebody to blame. And you realize that it's not easy for the citizens to fight their government. And the citizens will always look for the weakest target. And the foreigner who is poor and who stays in those areas is an easy target for, for those people. And at the end of the day, what you find out is that they go in there, they bend tires and they rob 1 or 2 shops and they take the commodities and they loot and all that. So at the end of the day, I think we are seeing South Africa going into a stage of nationalism that is extreme, and unfortunately, we would like to just congratulate the leadership of Julius Malema, who has said, no. We cannot accept votes from people that are Afrophobic, that are xenophobic, because to a larger extent, this is not xenophobia. It's a matter of South Africans that are, that are angry at fellow Africans, and not because those people are from a different race, but just because they are fellow Africans, and they feel that the opportunities are dwindling. At the end of the day, it's a fight for service delivery, it's populism from the politicians, and they are getting us into the abyss.
Okay, maybe we're running out of time. It's a fascinating discussion, but just a quick comment from the both of you, just to wrap up. what we've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just coming off what Tino said, I would completely agree. I think that this moment in our kind of political history, there's no doubt about the fact that African migrants are being used as scapegoats, and to see it happening at a time of great crisis on our borders really is a terrible thing, particularly given the history of political support, of migratory support of the SADC nations in our moments of disaster in our history. I mean, Mozambique, for example, was a huge recipient of people going into exile during the late 80s and the early 90s. And I think that we have this kind of amnesia when it comes to that kind of thing, when our neighbours are in the same kind of moment of disaster, or perhaps in some ways in this moment worse, and we are not willing to support and protect them.
Struan?
I think it's true, and it's a poor reflection on where we've moved from in terms of our constitutional values of inclusion and creating a South Africa in which all can have a future. And I think then that puts the main focus on the need for participation and community engagement with people, so that people have a sense that they have a stake in planning in the future.
Thank you very much, Struan Robertson, Knowledge Management Coordinator at the Seriti Institute, Robin Lenahan, Candidate Attorney, Lawyers for Human Rights, and Tino Mambeu, Independent Political Analyst. Thank you very much for joining us. Afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for everyone for watching, and tonight's edition of Capital Connection. Join us again every Monday and Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. From me, Chris Bishop, it's good night.